The worn fabric of a child's blanket would become the thread that wove together three broken lives on the coldest night of winter. Marcus Chen watched from his leather seat in the VIP waiting lounge as 8-year-old Jamie wrapped his only source of warmth around the shoulders of a stranger, not knowing that this single act of kindness would unlock her a fortune beyond imagination. The billionaire's hands trembled as memories of his own desperate childhood came flooding back. The same pattern, the same colors, the same impossible choice between survival and compassion. What happened next would prove that sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest miracles, but could one moment of pure innocence really bridge the gap between crushing poverty and unimaginable wealth? Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button for more real, emotional, life-changing stories like this. And let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The central station's fluorescent lights flickered against the December wind that howled through every crack and crevice of the massive terminal. Snow had been falling for 3 days straight, turning the bustling transportation hub into a refuge for those with nowhere else to go. Among the countless faces seeking shelter sat Sarah Wells and her son Jamie, huddled together on a metal bench that felt like ice against their backs. Sarah pulled her thin coat tighter around her shoulders, trying to create a barrier between her 8-year-old son and the bitter cold that seemed to seep through the very walls of the station. Their small suitcase sat between them, containing everything they owned in the world: a few changes of clothes, some crackers they'd been rationing for 2 days, and the faded blue blanket that had belonged to Jamie's grandmother. "Mom, are we going to be okay?" Jamie whispered, his breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. His dark eyes, too wise for his young face, searched his mother's expression for reassurance she wasn't sure she could provide. Sarah forced a smile and smoothed his unruly brown hair. "Of course we are, sweetheart. Tomorrow we'll take the bus to Aunt Linda's house, and everything will be better. You'll see." The lie tasted bitter in her mouth. She'd been telling herself the same thing for weeks, ever since they'd been evicted from their apartment. Aunt Linda lived 3 states away and hadn't returned any of Sarah's desperate phone calls. The station around them buzzed with activity despite the late hour. Travelers rushed past with expensive luggage and warm coats, their faces glowing from heated cars and comfortable homes. None of them seemed to notice the growing number of people who weren't traveling anywhere, who were simply trying to survive another night in temperatures that had dropped well below freezing. Jamie watched the crowds with curious eyes, taking in details that his mother was too exhausted to notice. He saw the security guard who kept walking past them with increasingly suspicious glances. He noticed the janitor who'd been mopping the same section of floor for 20 minutes, clearly stalling to stay near the warming vents. Most importantly, he saw the old man sitting alone on a bench, about 30 feet away. The stranger looked to be in his 70s, with silver hair that needed cutting and clothes that had seen better days. His hands, gnarled with age and work, shook as he tried to zip up a jacket that was far too thin for the weather. Every few minutes, a violent cough would shake his frail frame, and he'd press a worn handkerchief to his mouth with the careful movements of someone who'd been sick for a long time. "Mom?" Jamie tugged on Sarah's sleeve. "That man over there looks really cold." Sarah followed her son's gaze and felt her heart sink. The elderly gentleman was clearly in worse shape than they were, but she had barely enough resources to keep her own child warm. "I see him, honey. But there's not much we can do right now." Jamie nodded solemnly, but his eyes remained fixed on the shivering figure. The old man reminded him of his grandfather, who'd died 2 years earlier. Grandpa Joe had always been cold in his final months, and Jamie remembered how good it had made him feel to share his blanket during their visits to the nursing home. The temperature seemed to drop another degree as the night wore on. Sarah dozed fitfully against the hard bench, her arm wrapped protectively around Jamie, who was snuggled under his grandmother's blanket. The soft blue fabric, decorated with small white stars, had been a source of comfort through every difficult moment of his young life. When his parents had fought, when they'd moved from apartment to apartment, when his father had finally left for good, the blanket had been his constant companion. Around 2 in the morning, Jamie was awakened by the sound of harsh coughing. The old man was bent over, his whole body convulsing with each ragged breath. Several people walked past without stopping, too focused on their own destinations to spare a glance for someone else's suffering. Jamie looked down at his blanket, then at his sleeping mother, then back at the struggling stranger. His grandmother's voice echoed in his memory from a conversation they'd had shortly before she died. "Jamie, my boy," she'd said, her voice weak but her eyes bright, "true wealth isn't about what you have, it's about what you're willing to give when you have almost nothing left to give." Without waking his mother, Jamie carefully slipped out from under the blanket and folded it neatly. The cold hit him immediately, sending shivers through his small frame, but he ignored the discomfort and walked across the station to where the old man sat. "Excuse me, sir," Jamie said softly, not wanting to startle him. The man looked up with watery blue eyes that held both surprise and wariness. Up close, Jamie could see that his face was gaunt, his cheeks sunken, and his lips had a bluish tinge that spoke of more than just cold. "Yes, son?" the man asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I noticed you're really cold, and I thought maybe you could use this." Jamie held out the blanket, its soft fabric catching the harsh terminal lights and somehow looking warmer than anything else in the vast, cold space. The old man stared at the offering in disbelief. "Oh, child, I couldn't possibly take that from you. You need it to keep warm." Jamie shook his head firmly. "My mom and I have each other to keep warm, but you're all alone. Please take it. My grandma would want someone to use it to help somebody." Tears began to form in the stranger's eyes as he reached out with trembling hands to accept the gift. The moment the blanket touched his shoulders, he closed his eyes and took a deep, shuddering breath. "What's your name, young man?" "Jamie Wells. What's yours?" "Harold Peterson. And Jamie, this is the kindest thing anyone has done for me in years." Harold's voice cracked with emotion as he pulled the blanket tighter around himself. "How can I ever thank you?" "You don't have to thank me," Jamie replied with a simple sincerity that only children possess. "Just feel better, okay?" Harold nodded, unable to speak around the lump in his throat. He watched as Jamie walked back to his mother, wrapping his thin arms around himself against the cold. The boy settled back on the bench and curled up next to Sarah, who stirred slightly in her sleep but didn't wake. What neither Jamie nor Harold realized was that their entire interaction had been witnessed by someone else. Marcus Chen sat in the exclusive VIP lounge that overlooked the main terminal, separated from the crowds by floor-to-ceiling windows and a world of privilege that money could buy. At 62 years old, Marcus was one of the wealthiest men in the country, with business interests spanning technology, real estate, and philanthropy. His net worth was measured in billions, and his name graced buildings and charitable foundations across 3 continents. But as he watched the small boy give away his only blanket, Marcus was transported back 60 years to a very different time and place. He was 8 years old again, standing in a similar train station with his younger brother David, both of them orphaned and homeless after their parents died in a car accident. They'd been living on the streets for weeks, surviving on scraps and taking shelter wherever they could find it. Marcus remembered the blanket David had found in a dumpster behind a hotel, how his little brother had insisted they share it even though Marcus was bigger and could have claimed it for himself. That blanket had kept them alive through their first winter on the streets, and David's generosity had taught Marcus his first lesson about true brotherhood. The memory was so vivid that Marcus could almost feel the scratchy wool against his skin, could almost hear David's voice saying, "We take care of each other, Marky. That's what brothers do." It had been their motto, their survival strategy, their way of maintaining hope when everything else seemed hopeless. David had died of pneumonia the following winter, too weak from malnutrition to fight off the infection. Marcus had been holding that same blanket when his brother took his final breath, and he'd carried the guilt of survival for decades afterward. Every success, every triumph, every dollar he'd earned had been shadowed by the knowledge that David would never have the chance to grow up, to achieve his dreams, to experience the life they'd both fought so hard to reach. Now, watching Jamie's selfless act, Marcus felt something break open inside his chest. The boy's blanket was different from the one he and David had shared. It was blue instead of brown, decorated with stars instead of stripes, but the pattern was hauntingly similar. More importantly, the gesture was identical, the same instinctive generosity that had defined his brother's short life. Marcus wiped tears from his eyes, not caring if anyone in the lounge saw him crying. He'd built walls around his heart for decades, using his wealth and success as armor against the pain of his past. But this child's simple act of kindness had shattered those defenses in an instant, reminding him of the boy he'd once been and the brother he'd lost. He watched as Harold wrapped the blanket more tightly around himself, the old man's shivering finally beginning to subside. He saw Jamie curl up against his mother, his small frame trembling with cold, but his face peaceful with the satisfaction of having helped someone in need. The contrast between the boy's situation and his own struck Marcus like a physical blow. Here he sat, in climate-controlled luxury, wearing a suit that cost more than most people made in a month, waiting for his private jet to be refueled so he could fly to another board meeting in another city. Meanwhile, 30 feet below him, a child who had nothing was giving away his most precious possession to help a stranger. Marcus stood abruptly, his mind racing with possibilities. He could help this family, could change their lives with a single phone call, but he needed to be careful about how he approached them. His experience with philanthropy had taught him that people's pride was often more powerful than their need, and the wrong approach could cause them to reject help altogether. He left the VIP lounge and took the elevator down to the main terminal, his expensive shoes clicking against the polished floor as he walked toward the area where Jamie and his mother were sitting. Up close, he could see the exhaustion etched into Sarah's face, the way her clothes hung loose on her frame, suggesting recent weight loss. The suitcase beside them was old and battered, held together with tape and determination. Marcus approached slowly, not wanting to wake Sarah or frighten Jamie. Harold was still awake, clutching the blanket like a lifeline, and he looked up as the well-dressed stranger approached. "Excuse me," Marcus said quietly, settling onto a nearby bench. "I couldn't help but notice what just happened here, and I wanted to say something to you both." Harold studied Marcus with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to be wary of strangers. "Are you with security? Because we're not causing any trouble." The boy was just being kind. "No, I'm not with security," Marcus assured him. "Quite the opposite, actually. I wanted to thank you for letting me witness something beautiful tonight." Harold's expression softened slightly. "That boy there, Jamie, he's got a heart bigger than this whole station. Gave me his blanket when he could see I was cold. Haven't seen kindness like that in a long, long time." Marcus nodded, his throat tight with emotion. "I haven't either. May I ask your story, Harold? What brings you to the station on a night like this?" Harold hesitated, clearly debating how much to share with this stranger. Finally, he seemed to decide that anyone who would sit down and ask deserved an honest answer. "Lost my apartment last month when they raised the rent. Been staying at the shelter when they have room, but they were full tonight. Figured the station would be warmer than the street." "And your health?" Marcus asked gently, having noticed the man's persistent cough and frail appearance. "Not great," Harold admitted. "Got lung problems from working in the mines for 40 years. Can't afford the medicine anymore since I lost my insurance." He pulled the blanket tighter around himself. "But this little guy here just gave me something more valuable than any medicine: warmth and hope." Marcus felt his resolve strengthen. This wasn't just about helping one family anymore. It was about honoring the memory of his brother and the lesson the child had just taught him. "Harold, what if I told you that I might be able to help? Not just with a warm place to stay tonight, but with something more permanent." Harold's eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Mister, I've learned that when something sounds too good to be true, it usually is. What would you want in return?" "Nothing," Marcus said simply. "Sometimes the universe puts us in the right place at the right time to do the right thing. I believe tonight is one of those times." Before Harold could respond, Sarah began to stir. She opened her eyes slowly, immediately checking to make sure Jamie was still beside her, before noticing the well-dressed stranger sitting nearby. Her maternal instincts kicked in, and she pulled Jamie closer to her. "It's okay, Mom," Jamie said softly, having awakened when she moved. "This man was just talking to Harold about the blanket." Sarah looked from Marcus to Harold, taking in the scene with growing confusion. "I'm sorry. Do we know you?" Marcus stood and extended his hand. "My name is Marcus Chen. I witnessed your son's incredible act of kindness tonight, and I was hoping I might have a word with you both." Sarah didn't take his hand, her wariness evident. "What kind of word?" Look, if this is about us staying in the station, we're not bothering anyone. We'll be gone in the morning. Please, don't be afraid, Marcus said, lowering his hand but maintaining his gentle tone. I'm not here to cause you any trouble. Actually, I'm here because your son reminded me of someone very important to me, someone I lost a long time ago. Jamie looked up at his mother, then at Marcus. Who did I remind you of? Marcus knelt down so he was at eye level with the boy. My little brother David. When we were about your age, we were in a situation very similar to yours. We didn't have much, but David always shared whatever we had with people who needed it more. What happened to him? Jamie asked with the directness that only children possess. He died when he was very young, Marcus said softly. But he taught me something important before he left. He taught me that taking care of each other is the most important thing we can do. Sarah's expression softened slightly, recognizing genuine grief in the stranger's voice. I'm sorry for your loss. Thank you, Marcus replied. And I'm sorry for yours. I can see that you're going through a difficult time. Sarah's defenses went back up immediately. We're fine. We don't need charity. I'm not offering charity, Marcus said carefully. I'm offering opportunity. Let me tell you a story, and then you can decide for yourself. He settled back onto the bench, making sure he didn't appear threatening or pushy. 60 years ago, my brother and I were homeless. We lived on the streets, in shelters when we could get in places like this, when we couldn't. David was always giving away whatever little we had, just like Jamie did. Tonight, Jamie listened intently, fascinated by the idea that this well-dressed man had once been like him. Were you scared? Terrified, Marcus admitted. But David always said we had to take care of each other, that family meant never letting each other face the world alone. That lesson has guided every decision I've made since then. Sarah was beginning to see where this conversation was heading, and she didn't like it. Look, Mr. Chen, I appreciate your story, but my son and I don't need saving. We're going to be fine. I'm sure you are, Marcus agreed. You've raised an incredible young man, and that doesn't happen by accident. It takes strength, wisdom, and love. But sometimes accepting help isn't about needing to be saved. It's about allowing someone else the opportunity to honor a promise they made long ago. Harold, who had been listening quietly, spoke up. What kind of promise? Marcus turned to him with gratitude for the opening. I promised my brother that if I ever had the chance to help families like ours, I would do it. I've spent decades building businesses and creating jobs, but tonight I realized I'd been missing the most important part, the personal connection, the chance to look someone in the eye and say, you're not alone anymore. What exactly are you proposing? Sarah asked, her voice still cautious but no longer openly hostile. Marcus took a deep breath. I own a property development company with projects all over the country. I also run a foundation that provides job training and placement services. What I'm proposing is this. A job for you, Sarah, if you're interested and qualified, housing for your family while you get back on your feet, and for Harold, medical care and a place to live with dignity. The silence that followed was deafening. Sarah stared at Marcus as if he'd just spoken in a foreign language, while Jamie looked back and forth between the adults, trying to understand what was happening. That's impossible, Sarah finally whispered. Things like that don't happen to people like us. They do tonight, Marcus said firmly. Jamie, when you gave Harold your blanket, you didn't do it because you expected anything in return, did you? Jamie shook his head. I did it because he was cold, and I could help. Exactly. And now I'm in a position to help, because watching you reminded me why I worked so hard in the first place. Not for money or recognition, but for moments like this. Harold leaned forward, the blanket still wrapped around his shoulders. Son, I've been around long enough to know when someone's telling the truth. This man isn't running some kind of scam. I can see it in his eyes. He's carrying the same kind of pain I've been carrying since I lost my wife. Sarah looked at Harold with surprise. She hadn't known about his loss, but she could see the truth of it in his weathered face. I'm sorry, Harold. You didn't mention. She died 6 months ago, Harold said simply. Cancer. That's how I ended up here. Couldn't keep up with the medical bills and the rent both. Been trying to figure out how to keep going ever since. The raw honesty in his voice seemed to break something loose in Sarah. She felt her carefully constructed walls beginning to crumble, and for the first time in months, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, their situation could actually improve. "What would you need from us?" she asked Marcus, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just a chance to prove that good things can still happen," Marcus replied. "I'd need to know about your work experience, your skills, what kind of life you want to build for Jamie, but most importantly, I'd need you to trust me long enough to let me show you what's possible." Jamie, who had been listening to the adult conversation with growing excitement, suddenly spoke up. "Mom, remember what Grandma used to say? She said when good things happen, we shouldn't be afraid of them." Sarah felt tears welling up in her eyes. Her mother had indeed said that, usually when Sarah was being too prideful to accept help from family or friends. It had been one of her mother's most frequent pieces of advice, and hearing it from Jamie's innocent lips felt like a message from beyond. "I have a degree in accounting," Sarah said quietly. "I lost my job when the company downsized, and then I couldn't keep up with the rent. I've been looking for work, but without an address, it's been almost impossible." Marcus nodded understanding. "I have several companies that could use someone with accounting experience. But more than that, I have a network of business partners who are always looking for qualified people. The key is getting you stable first, so you can present yourself as the professional you are." "And what about Jamie's schooling?" Sarah asked, her protective instincts still sharp despite her growing hope. "There are excellent schools near all of our properties," Marcus assured her. "Jamie seems like a bright young man, and I'd want to make sure he has every opportunity to succeed." Jamie tugged on his mother's sleeve. "Mom, can we say yes? I think this is what Grandma meant about good things happening." Sarah looked at her son, then at Harold, who was nodding encouragingly, and finally at Marcus. She tried to find some sign of deception in his face, some indication that this was too good to be true, but all she saw was genuine kindness and a deep sadness that spoke of someone who understood loss. "Why us?" she asked finally. "Out of all the people you could help, why choose a woman and her son that you've never met?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, gathering his thoughts. "Because Jamie made a choice tonight that most adults wouldn't make. He looked at someone who was suffering and decided that their comfort was more important than his own. That's not something you can teach, Sarah. That's something that comes from the heart, and it tells me everything I need to know about the kind of people you are." He paused, his voice becoming even more emotional. "But also because I made a promise to my brother that I'd been keeping in boardrooms and foundation meetings for decades. Tonight, I finally have the chance to keep it in the way that really matters, person to person, heart to heart." Harold adjusted the blanket around his shoulders and looked at Sarah. "Ma'am, I've got nothing left to lose and everything to gain. This man is offering us a second chance at life. I think we'd be fools not to take it." Sarah felt the last of her resistance crumble. She'd been fighting so hard for so long, trying to be strong for Jamie, trying to solve their problems on her own. The idea of accepting help felt like admitting defeat, but looking at her son's hopeful face, she realized that sometimes admitting you need help is actually the strongest thing you can do. "What happens next?" she asked Marcus. Marcus smiled, and for the first time since David's death, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. "Next, we get out of this cold station and into somewhere warm. I have a car waiting outside that can take us to a hotel for tonight. Tomorrow, we'll start figuring out the details." "All of us?" Harold asked, hardly daring to believe he was included in this miracle. "All of us," Marcus confirmed. "Harold, I meant what I said about medical care and housing. You gave Jamie the gift of gratitude tonight, and that's something I don't take lightly." As they gathered their few possessions and prepared to leave the station, Jamie carefully folded the blanket and handed it back to Harold. "You should keep this," he said. "It belongs with you now." Harold's eyes filled with tears as he accepted the blanket. "Jamie, this is the most precious thing anyone has ever given me. I'll treasure it always." "Just make sure you stay warm," Jamie replied with a smile. Marcus watched the exchange with deep emotion, remembering the last conversation he'd had with David. His brother had made him promise to use his life to help others, to never forget where they'd come from, or how it felt to have nothing. Tonight, finally, Marcus felt like he was keeping that promise in a way that would have made David proud. As they walked toward the station exit, Marcus found himself thinking about the chain of events that had led to this moment. If he hadn't been delayed in the VIP lounge, if Jamie hadn't seen Harold shivering, if the boy hadn't had the courage to approach a stranger with kindness, none of this would be happening. It was the kind of coincidence that made him believe in fate, in the idea that sometimes the universe conspires to put the right people in the right place at exactly the right time. The car Marcus had mentioned turned out to be a luxury sedan with a driver who helped them load their meager belongings without comment or judgment. As they settled into the warm interior, Sarah felt like she was living in a dream. Just hours earlier, she'd been wondering how they would survive another night in the cold station. Now, they were riding in comfort toward a future she couldn't have imagined. "Mr. Chen," Jamie said from his seat beside the window, "do you think your brother would have liked me?" Marcus felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I think he would have loved you, Jamie. You remind me so much of him that it takes my breath away. I wish I could have met him," Jamie said thoughtfully. "He sounds like he was a really good person." "He was the best person I've ever known," Marcus replied. "And you know what? I think in a way, you did meet him tonight. When you gave Harold your blanket, you were carrying on David's spirit of generosity." Harold, who was sitting across from them with the blanket still wrapped around his shoulders, spoke up quietly. "Sometimes I think the people we've lost send us angels to remind us that love never really dies. Tonight, Jamie was an angel for me." Sarah reached over and squeezed her son's hand. She'd always known he had a good heart, but seeing the impact of his kindness on these two men made her realize that she'd raised something truly special. Despite all their hardships, despite the uncertainty and fear of the past few months, Jamie had maintained his compassion and his willingness to help others. The hotel Marcus took them to was unlike anything Sarah and Jamie had ever experienced. The lobby was filled with marble and crystal, and uniformed staff moved efficiently to serve guests who looked like they belonged in a different world. Sarah felt acutely aware of her worn clothes and tired appearance, but Marcus guided them through the elegant space with such natural authority that no one questioned their presence. He'd arranged for adjoining suites, one for Sarah and Jamie, another for Harold. The rooms were warm and comfortable, with soft beds and modern amenities that felt like luxuries after their recent experiences. Room service delivered hot meals that they ate together in Marcus's suite, talking late into the night about their hopes and dreams for the future. "I want to be a teacher when I grow up," Jamie announced as he finished his second helping of pasta. "I want to help kids learn things and be kind to each other." Marcus smiled at the boy's simple ambition. "That's a wonderful goal, Jamie. Teachers change the world one student at a time." Harold, who had been quiet during most of the meal, suddenly spoke up. "You know, I used to be a teacher before I went to work in the mines. Taught third grade for 5 years right after I got out of college." "Really?" Jamie's eyes lit up with excitement. "What was it like?" "Best job I ever had," Harold said with a nostalgic smile. "Kids that age still believe in magic, still think anything is possible. Every day was an adventure." "Why did you stop?" Sarah asked gently. Harold's expression grew sad. "Money. My wife and I wanted to start a family, and teachers didn't make enough to support the life we dreamed of. So I took a job in the mines, figured I'd go back to teaching later. But later never came." Marcus had been listening to this conversation with growing interest. "Harold, what if later could be now?" Harold looked at him with confusion. "What do you mean?" "I mean, what if part of your second chance included going back to teaching? I fund several educational initiatives, including programs for underprivileged children. We're always looking for experienced educators who understand what it means to struggle." End quote. Harold's hand shook as he set down his coffee cup. "Marcus, I'm 73 years old. I haven't been in a classroom in 40 years. I'm not sure I'd even remember how to teach." "I think you'd remember faster than you think," Marcus said gently. "And there are children out there who need someone exactly like you. Someone who's lived through hardship and come out the other side with wisdom and compassion." Jamie bounced in his seat with excitement. "Harold could teach me. We could practice together." The old man's eyes filled with tears at the boy's enthusiasm. "You'd want me to help you with your studies?" "Of course! You're really smart, and you're nice, and you know about being a teacher. It would be perfect." Sarah watched this exchange with wonder. In the space of a few hours, they'd gone from being strangers sharing a cold train station to feeling like a chosen family. It was almost too much to process, but the warmth in the room, the full bellies, and the hope in everyone's voices made it impossible to doubt that something miraculous was happening. As the evening wound down, Marcus outlined his plans in more detail. He owned a residential development in a mid-sized city about 2 hours away, a community designed for working families with good schools, parks, and shopping nearby. There were several job openings at his corporate headquarters in the same city, including positions that would be perfect for Sarah's accounting background. "The transition won't be instant," he warned them. "There will be paperwork, interviews, settling in periods, but I can promise you that by the end of the month, you'll have stable housing and steady income." Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as the reality of their changed circumstances sank in. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to thank me," Marcus replied. "You need to succeed. You need to build the life you and Jamie deserve. That's the only thanks I need." Harold wrapped the blanket more tightly around himself and looked at Jamie with profound gratitude. "Son, when you gave me this blanket tonight, you saved more than just my life. You reminded me that there's still goodness in the world, still reason to hope." Jamie smiled sleepily, the events of the day finally catching up with him. "Grandma always said that sharing makes everything better." "Your grandmother was a wise woman," Marcus said softly. "And she raised a wise daughter who's raising an even wiser grandson." Over the following weeks, Marcus kept every promise he'd made that night in the train station. Sarah was hired as a senior accountant at his corporate headquarters, a position that came with excellent benefits and opportunities for advancement. Jamie was enrolled in one of the area's best elementary schools, where his teachers quickly recognized his intelligence and kind heart. Harold's transformation was perhaps the most remarkable of all. After getting the medical care he needed and regaining his strength, he began working part-time with Marcus's educational foundation, developing programs for at-risk children. His decades of life experience, combined with his natural teaching ability, made him incredibly effective at reaching kids who had given up on themselves. The three of them settled into a rhythm that felt surprisingly natural. Sarah and Jamie lived in a comfortable townhouse in Marcus's development, while Harold had a cozy apartment in the same complex. They shared dinners several times a week, and Harold helped Jamie with his homework every evening. The boy thrived under the attention, his grades improving dramatically as his confidence grew. Marcus found himself visiting them more often than he'd initially planned. After decades of feeling disconnected from the personal side of his philanthropy, being directly involved in their lives gave him the sense of purpose he'd been missing. He attended Jamie's school plays, celebrated Sarah's promotion to department supervisor, and cheered when Harold was invited to speak at a national education conference about working with disadvantaged youth. 6 months after that cold night in the train station, Marcus received a package in the mail with no return address. Inside was a small, carefully wrapped bundle that made his hands tremble when he opened it. It was Harold's blanket, the blue one with white stars that Jamie had given him, but now it was accompanied by a letter written in the old man's careful script. "Dear Marcus," the letter read, "this blanket has given me more than warmth over these past months. It's given me hope, purpose, and a new family. But I think it's time for it to find its next home. There's a children's shelter downtown that could use donations, and I thought you might want to take this there personally. Not because the children need one more blanket, but because they need to hear the story that goes with it. They need to know that kindness is never wasted, that generosity always comes back to us, and that sometimes the smallest gestures create the biggest miracles. Thank you for giving an old man the chance to matter again. Your friend always, Harold." Marcus sat in his office, holding the blanket and remembering that night 6 months earlier. He thought about David, about the promise he'd made, about the way Jamie's simple act of kindness had changed all their lives. The blanket felt warm in his hands, as if it carried within its fibers all the love and hope that had been shared since that winter night. That afternoon, Marcus drove to the children's shelter Harold had mentioned. He found the director, a tired-looking woman who brightened considerably when he introduced himself and explained why he was there. She gathered the children, about 20 kids ranging in age from 5 to 15, and Marcus told them the story of Jamie, Harold, Sarah, and a blanket that had traveled from one generous heart to another. "The most important thing to remember," Marcus concluded, looking at each young face in turn, "is that you're never too small, too poor, or too powerless to change someone's life." Jamie was 8 years old and had almost nothing, but he changed everything for all of us. A little girl in the front row raised her hand. "Mr. Marcus, what happened to the boy who gave away his blanket?" Marcus smiled, thinking of Jamie's latest school report, which had been filled with praise for both his academic achievements and his continued kindness to classmates. "He's doing wonderfully. He's in 4th grade now, making excellent grades, and he still has the biggest heart of anyone I know. And you know what the best part is?" The children leaned forward eagerly. "He doesn't even realize how special he is. He thinks what he did was normal, that anyone would have done the same thing. But that's what makes truly good people special. They do extraordinary things and think they're ordinary." Marcus left the blanket with the children, but he took something even more valuable with him: the reminder that generosity is contagious, that kindness multiplies when it's shared, and that sometimes the most profound changes begin with the smallest gestures. As he drove home that evening, Marcus reflected on how dramatically his life had changed since that night in the train station. For years, he'd been successful but somehow empty, accumulating wealth and recognition while feeling increasingly disconnected from the reasons he'd started working so hard in the first place. Jamie's simple act of giving had reminded him that true success wasn't measured in dollars or accolades, but in the lives you touched and the love you shared along the way. The following year brought even more changes for their unconventional family. Sarah was promoted again, this time to Regional Finance Director, a position that came with increased responsibilities and the opportunity to travel. She'd grown in confidence dramatically, her natural intelligence and work ethic finally having the platform they deserved. The scared, desperate woman who'd huddled in the train station had been replaced by a poised professional who commanded respect in every room she entered. Jamie continued to excel in school, but more importantly, he maintained the generous spirit that had started everything. His teachers reported that he was always the first to help struggling classmates, that he shared his lunch with kids who forgot theirs, and that he had an uncanny ability to spot and comfort children who were feeling left out or lonely. The school counselor told Sarah that Jamie had single-handedly transformed the social dynamics of his classroom, creating an environment where kindness was cool and helping others was the norm rather than the exception. Harold's renaissance was perhaps the most remarkable transformation of all. The frail, sick man who'd been slowly dying in the train station had been replaced by a vibrant educator who'd found his life's true calling. His work with at-risk youth had gained national attention, and he'd been invited to develop curriculum for schools across the country. More importantly, he'd become a father figure to dozens of children who desperately needed positive male role models in their lives. But it was Harold's relationship with Jamie that remained the most special. Every evening, the old man would sit with the boy at the kitchen table, helping with homework, but also sharing stories of his own childhood, his years as a young teacher, and the lessons he'd learned during his darkest moments. Jamie absorbed these conversations like a sponge, his understanding of the world deepening with each shared story. One evening, almost exactly a year after their Sakura first meeting, Jamie asked Harold a question that had been weighing on his mind. "Harold, do you think everything happens for a reason?" Harold looked up from the math problems they'd been working on together. "What makes you ask that, son?" "Son? Well, if Mom and I hadn't lost our apartment, we wouldn't have been in the train station. And if we hadn't been there, I wouldn't have seen you, and I wouldn't have given you the blanket. And then Mr. Marcus wouldn't have seen it happen, and none of us would be here now." Harold smiled at the boy's logical mind working through the chain of events. "You know, Jamie, I've been thinking about that same question for months now. I think maybe the reason isn't as important as what we choose to do when difficult things happen to us." "What do you mean?" "I mean that you and your mom could have responded to losing your home by becoming bitter or angry or closed off from other people. Instead, you chose to stay kind and generous, even when you had almost nothing to give. That choice is what made everything else possible. Jamie considered this thoughtfully. So, it's not that bad things happen for a reason, but that we can choose to make good things come from bad things. Exactly, Harold said, marveling at the child's wisdom. You took something that should have made you selfish, being cold and scared and homeless, and you used it to make you more generous instead. That's not luck or fate, Jamie. That's character. Marcus, who had arrived for dinner and overheard the conversation from the doorway, felt his heart swell with pride. This was what David would have wanted, he realized. Not just financial success or professional recognition, but the creation of a family bound together by love and shared values. The boy his brother had been would have grown up to be exactly like Jamie, generous and thoughtful and wise beyond his years. As they sat down to dinner that night, Sarah raised her glass of water and a toast. I want to say something to all of you. A year ago, I thought my life was over. I thought I'd failed as a mother, as a provider, as a person. I was ready to give up hope entirely. She paused, her voice becoming emotional. But Jamie taught me that hope isn't something you have or don't have. It's something you choose to share, even when you can barely hold on to it yourself. And Harold and Marcus, you showed me that accepting help isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign of trust in the goodness of other people. Harold reached across the table and patted her hand gently. Sarah, you didn't fail at anything. You raised a son who sees suffering and responds with compassion. That's not failure. That's the greatest success any parent can achieve. Marcus nodded in agreement. David used to say that love is the only thing that multiplies when you divide it. Watching your family over this past year, I finally understand what he meant. Jamie, who had been listening to the adult conversation with the serious attention he gave to important matters, suddenly smiled. I think Grandma would be proud of how her blanket helped so many people. I think she would too, Sarah agreed, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. The years that followed continued to bring growth and change for all of them. Sarah eventually started her own accounting firm, with Marcus as her first major client and biggest supporter. Her business thrived, and she found herself in a position to help other struggling families, hiring single mothers and providing flexible work arrangements that allowed them to balance career and family responsibilities. Jamie grew into a teenager who never lost his compassionate heart. He started a peer counseling program at his high school, volunteered at the same children's shelter where Marcus had left the blanket, and maintained a grade point average that earned him scholarship offers from prestigious universities. But perhaps most importantly, he continued to see the world through eyes that looked for ways to help rather than ways to get ahead. Harold's work with disadvantaged youth expanded into a full-scale nonprofit organization. He wrote books about his empire, teaching methods, traveled the country, speaking at conferences, and personally mentored hundreds of children who were struggling with poverty, family problems, or simply the challenge of growing up in a difficult world. The frail man who had nearly died in a train station became a nationally recognized expert on BRF, child development, and educational psychology. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most to all of them. Sunday dinners around Sarah's dining room table, where they shared stories and dreams and plans for the future. Evenings when Harold would fall asleep in his armchair while helping Jamie with homework, and the boy would quietly cover him with a throw blanket. Holidays when Marcus would arrive with arms full of presents, but leave with his heart full of something much more valuable, the knowledge that he belonged somewhere, that he was part of a family that had chosen him just as he had chosen them. 5 years after that cold night in the train station, Marcus received an invitation that made his hands shake as he read it. Jamie, now 13 and preparing for high school, had written to ask if Marcus would officially become his godfather in a ceremony at their church. The letter was written in Jamie's careful handwriting, and it explained that while he was grateful for everything Marcus had given their family, what mattered most was that Marcus had shown him what it meant to turn success into service. You've taught me that being rich isn't about how much money you have, Jamie wrote, but about how much love you can share and how many people you can help. I want to be like you when I grow up, not because you're successful, but because you use your success to make other people's lives better. The ceremony was small, but deeply meaningful. Harold served as Jamie's sponsor. Sarah stood proudly beside her son, and Marcus felt a completeness he hadn't experienced since David's death. As the pastor spoke about the responsibilities of godparenthood, Marcus thought about the promise he'd made to his brother all those years ago. He'd kept it in boardrooms and foundation meetings, through charitable donations and business ventures designed to create jobs and opportunities. But this was different. This was personal. This was about love and family and the daily choice to put someone else's well-being before your own. This was about becoming the kind of man his brother had always believed he could be. After the ceremony, they went back to Sarah's house for a celebration dinner. As they sat around the table, sharing food and laughter and stories, Marcus realized that this was what wealth really looked like. Not the numbers in his bank account or the properties he owned or the businesses he'd built, but the faces around this table, the love that connected them all, the knowledge that they would be there for each other no matter what challenges lay ahead. Jamie, now taller and more mature, but still possessing the same generous heart, raised his glass of sparkling cider. "I want to make a toast," he announced, "to blankets and train stations and the way small kindnesses can change everything." Harold laughed, remembering that night so clearly it seemed like yesterday. "To second chances and new beginnings." Sarah added, "To the family we chose and the love that chose us." Marcus felt tears running down his cheeks as he raised his own glass. "To David, who taught me that the most important thing we can do is take care of each other. And to all of you, who showed me that some promises are worth waiting a lifetime to keep." As they clinked glasses and dissolved into laughter and conversation, Marcus felt his brother's presence in the room as clearly as if David were sitting at the table beside him. The promise had been kept, not just in the grand gestures and dramatic changes, but in the daily choice to love and support and care for the people who mattered most. Years later, when Jamie graduated as valedictorian of his high school class, his speech would center on the lesson he'd learned that cold night in a train station. He would tell his classmates about the power of small acts of kindness, about the way generosity creates ripples that spread far beyond what we can see or imagine. "My grandmother used to say that true wealth isn't about what you have, but about what you're willing to give when you have almost nothing left," Jamie would say, looking out at the audience and finding the three people who had shaped his understanding of love and generosity. "I learned that lesson when I was 8 years old, and it changed not just my life, but the lives of everyone I love most in this world." In the audience, Sarah would wipe away tears of pride. Harold would beam with the satisfaction of a teacher whose student had surpassed every expectation. And Marcus would think about a 7-year-old boy named David, who had given his older brother a blanket and a lesson that had taken 60 years to fully understand. The blue blanket with white stars had long since found its way to other hands, other hearts that needed warming. But its legacy lived on in the lives it had touched, in the family it had helped create, and in the reminder that, sometimes, the most powerful force in the world is simply the decision to care about someone else's suffering and do something, anything, to help ease their pain. That night in the train station had lasted only a few hours, but its impact would ripple through generations. Jamie would grow up to become a teacher like Harold, dedicating his life to helping disadvantaged children reach their potential. Sarah would expand her business into a national firm that specialized in helping nonprofit organizations manage their finances more effectively. Harold would live to see his educational methods adopted in schools across the country, touching thousands of lives through the children he'd taught and the teachers he'd trained. And Marcus would continue to build and grow and succeed, but now with the understanding that every achievement was meaningless unless it somehow made the world a little bit warmer, a little bit kinder, a little bit more like the world his brother David had always believed was possible. In the end, the story of a little boy who shared his blanket with a freezing old man became the story of how love multiplies when it's shared, how kindness creates connections that transcend circumstances, and how sometimes the smallest gestures really do create the biggest miracles. It became the story of a family that chose each other across the barriers of age and background and circumstance, bound together not by blood, but by the deeper connection of souls who recognized their shared humanity and chose to honor it with their lives. And somewhere in the city, in a children's shelter where a blue blanket with white stars continued to provide comfort to those who needed it most, new stories were beginning. New connections were forming. New miracles were taking root in the simple, powerful choice to look at another person's suffering and respond not with indifference, but with love. 10 years had passed since that transformative night, and Jamie Wells had just turned 23. Fresh out of college, with a degree in education and social work, he stood before the board of directors at the Chen Foundation, presenting his proposal for a revolutionary new program. The conference room was filled with some of the most powerful philanthropists in the country, but Jamie felt calm and confident as he clicked to his first slide. The Blanket Project, he announced, isn't just about providing physical warmth to homeless individuals. It's about creating a network of compassion that connects communities across economic and social divides. Marcus, now in his 70s but still sharp and engaged, leaned forward with interest. He'd watched Jamie grow from that generous 8-year-old into a passionate advocate for social justice, and he'd never been prouder of anyone in his life. The concept is simple, Jamie continued. We partner with schools, businesses, and community organizations to create warmth stations throughout the city, but each blanket comes with a story card, telling the recipient about the person or group who donated it. More importantly, it includes contact information for follow-up support services. Dr. Patricia Wong, the Foundation's education director, raised her hand. How do you ensure the safety and appropriateness of these connections? Jamie smiled, having anticipated this question. Each warmth station is staffed by trained volunteers, many of them formerly homeless individuals who've successfully transitioned to stable housing. They serve as bridges between the donors and recipients, facilitating connections only when both parties are interested and appropriate screening has been completed. End quote. The presentation continued for another hour, with Jamie fielding questions about funding, implementation timelines, and measurable outcomes. His passion for the project was evident in every word, and by the time he finished, the entire board was nodding in agreement. After the vote to approve funding was unanimous, Marcus approached his godson with visible emotion. Jamie, this is exactly what David would have wanted. You've taken our story and turned it into something that can help thousands of people. I learned from the best, Jamie replied, embracing the man who had become like a grandfather to him. Besides, Harold did most of the research on effective intervention strategies. This is really his project as much as mine. Harold, now 81, and officially retired, but still sharp as ever, had indeed been instrumental in developing the program's framework. His decades of experience working with vulnerable populations had provided crucial insights into what worked and what didn't when it came to connecting people across different circumstances. Sarah, who now served on the Foundation's board herself, watched the interaction between Marcus and Jamie with deep satisfaction. Her own journey from desperate single mother to successful businesswoman had been remarkable, but seeing her son develop into such a compassionate leader felt like her greatest achievement. I have an announcement to make, Sarah said, standing up as the board meeting began to wind down. Chen Wells Accounting has been approached by the city to conduct a comprehensive audit of homeless services funding. If we get the contract, we'll be donating our full fee to the Blanket Project. The room erupted in applause, and Jamie felt overwhelmed by the continued generosity of the people he considered family. Sarah's firm had grown into one of the most respected accounting practices in the region, with a client list that included major corporations and nonprofit organizations throughout the state. But it was what happened after the board meeting that truly demonstrated how far they'd all come. As they gathered for dinner at Marcus's penthouse apartment, Harold pulled out a worn newspaper clipping that he'd been carrying in his wallet for months. I wanted to share something with all of you, he said, his voice still strong despite his advanced age. Remember Anna, the little girl who was at the children's shelter when Marcus first brought the blanket there? Everyone nodded. Anna had been one of the youngest children at the shelter, a shy 6-year-old who had barely spoken to anyone during their visit. She graduated from high school last month, Harold continued, his eyes bright with pride. Valedictorian of her class, full scholarship to State University. She wants to study social work. Harold passed around the newspaper clipping, which featured a photo of Anna at graduation and a quote about how a story she'd heard as a child about a boy sharing his blanket had inspired her to dedicate her life to helping others. She specifically mentioned that story in her graduation speech, Harold said. Said it taught her that kindness doesn't require wealth or power, just a willingness to see someone else's need and respond to it. Jamie stared at the newspaper clipping, seeing his own 8-year-old face reflected in Anna's determined expression. The ripple effects of that night in the train station continued to spread in ways none of them could have imagined. There's more, Harold added with a mischievous smile. Anna reached out to the foundation last week. She wants to intern with the Blanket Project this summer before starting college. The room fell silent as the magnitude of this connection sank in. A child who had been inspired by their story was now ready to become part of continuing it. Marcus stood up slowly, his eyes bright with unshed tears. David, I hope you can see this, he whispered, looking up toward the ceiling. I hope you know that your lesson about taking care of each other is still spreading, still changing lives. The following months were a whirlwind of activity as the Blanket Project moved from concept to reality. Jamie worked 18-hour days, coordinating with city officials, training volunteers, and establishing partnerships with local businesses. Sarah managed the complex financial logistics of the program, while Harold developed training materials for the volunteer staff. Marcus provided not just funding, but also his extensive network of contacts, opening doors that might have remained closed to a newer organization. His reputation in the business community lent credibility to the project, while his personal story provided the emotional foundation that made people want to get involved. The first Blanket Project warmth station opened on a cold Tuesday morning in November, exactly 11 years after that night in the train station. The location was deliberately chosen, a small storefront just 3 blocks from the train station where their journey had begun. Jamie stood outside the storefront at dawn, watching as volunteers arrived to begin their first day of operation. Among them was Anna, now 18, and radiating the same quiet compassion that had characterized her childhood. She'd grown into a poised young woman with dark hair and intelligent eyes that seemed to see straight into people's hearts. Mr. Jamie? Anna said, approaching him with a warm smile. I can't believe this day is finally here. Neither can I, Jamie admitted. And please, just call me Jamie. We're all equals in this work. As the day progressed, the warmth station served 43 individuals, providing not just blankets but also hot coffee, resource information, and most importantly, human connection. Each person who received a blanket also received a story card explaining who had donated it and why. The first recipient was an elderly woman named Rosa, who had been living in her car since losing her apartment. The blanket she received had been donated by a 4th-grade class at Lincoln Elementary, and the story card included drawings from the children and a message about hoping she would stay warm and safe. These children drew pictures for me? Rosa asked, her voice filled with wonder as she looked at the colorful artwork on the card. Anna nodded gently. They wanted you to know that someone cares about you. Rosa clutched the blanket to her chest and began to cry. It had been months since anyone had treated her with such kindness, and the simple gesture from children she'd never met touched something deep in her heart that she'd thought was permanently broken. By the end of the first week, word about the warmth station had spread throughout the homeless community. But, more surprisingly, it had also spread among housed residents of the city. Families began stopping by to donate blankets, businesses offered to sponsor entire warmth stations, and schools competed to see which class could create the most encouraging story cards. The project's impact extended far beyond its original scope. Middle school students who had written story cards began asking their teachers about homelessness and poverty. Business executives who had funded warmth stations started volunteering their time on weekends. Entire neighborhoods that had previously ignored homeless individuals began organizing to provide ongoing support. But perhaps the most profound change was in the volunteers themselves. Many of them were people who had once been recipients of similar services, and the opportunity to give back provided them with a sense of purpose and dignity that transformed their own recovery journeys. Among these volunteers was a man named Miguel, who had been homeless for 3 years before connecting with services through the original warmth station. He'd struggled with addiction and mental health issues, but the consistent kindness he'd received from volunteers had given him hope when he had none left. 6 months ago, I was sleeping on that bench over there, Miguel told a group of new volunteers during training. I felt like I was invisible, like I didn't matter to anyone. The volunteers here didn't just give me a blanket, they gave me back my humanity. Miguel had been clean for 4 months now and was living in transitional housing while working toward independent living. His role as a volunteer allowed him to provide the same hope to others that he'd received, creating a cycle of healing that strengthened the entire community. As winter deepened, the blanket project expanded to include mobile units that could reach individuals who were unable or unwilling to come to the fixed warmth stations. These converted vans traveled throughout the city, staffed by teams of volunteers who understood that sometimes help needed to come to people where they were. Jamie often rode along on these mobile units, finding that his direct contact with the people they served kept him grounded in the real purpose of their work. It was easy to get caught up in the administrative aspects of running a large program, but seeing the faces of individual people reminded him why they had started this work in the first place. One particularly cold evening, the mobile unit stopped near a highway overpass where a small encampment had formed. Among the people sheltering there was a teenage girl who couldn't have been more than 16, huddled alone with only a thin jacket for protection against the freezing wind. "Hi there," Jamie said gently as he approached her. "I'm Jamie, and we're here with some warm blankets and hot coffee. Would you like some?" The girl looked up at him with eyes that held too much pain for someone so young. "I don't have any money," she said quietly. "You don't need money," Jamie assured her. "Everything we have is free, no questions asked." As he wrapped a thick, soft blanket around her shoulders, Jamie saw something in her face that reminded him of his own desperation on that night 11 years ago. The same fear, the same exhaustion, the same desperate hope that maybe someone would care enough to help. "What's your name?" he asked, as he handed her a cup of steaming coffee. "Lily," she replied, accepting the warmth gratefully. "Lily, do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight?" She shook her head, and Jamie felt his heart break a little. This girl was younger than he'd been when everything had changed for his family, and she was facing the same terrifying uncertainty they'd experienced. "Would you be interested in talking to someone about some options?" Jamie asked carefully. "No pressure, but we work with some really good programs that help young people in situations like yours." Lily hesitated, clearly torn between hope and fear. "What kind of programs?" Over the next hour, Jamie sat with Lily and explained the various resources available to her. He talked about transitional housing for youth, educational support programs, and counseling services. But more than the specific programs, he shared his own story, telling her about the night his mother had held him on a bench in a train station and how one person's kindness had changed everything. "You really think things could get better?" Lily asked, her voice barely audible over the wind. "I know they can," Jamie replied with complete conviction. "It might not happen overnight, and it might not be easy, but yes, things can absolutely get better." By the end of the evening, Lily had agreed to come to the warmth station the next day to speak with a counselor about her options. As the mobile unit prepared to leave, she clutched the blanket around herself and looked up at Jamie with something that looked like hope beginning to bloom in her eyes. "Thank you," she said simply. "Thank you for trusting us," Jamie replied. "And Lily?" That blanket was donated by a family who wanted whoever received it to know that they're not alone in this world. You're not alone. As they drove away from the encampment, Jamie thought about the circular nature of kindness and how receiving help often prepared people to give help to others. He'd gone from being the child who needed a miracle to being the adult who could provide miracles for other children. The following day, Lily arrived at the warmth station as promised. She was nervous and clearly exhausted, but she was there. Anna, who had become skilled at working with young people in crisis, sat with her for hours, patiently explaining options and helping her navigate the complex system of services available to homeless youth. Within a week, Lily was placed in a transitional housing program specifically designed for teenagers aging out of foster care. She enrolled in a GED program and began working with a counselor to address the trauma that had led to her homelessness in the first place. But perhaps most importantly, she began volunteering at the warmth station on weekends, helping other young people who were facing similar challenges. Her own recent experience with homelessness made her uniquely qualified to connect with youth who were suspicious of adult helpers. "Sometimes they'll listen to me when they won't listen to anyone else," Lily explained to Jamie during one of their regular check-ins. "I think it's because they know I really understand what they're going through." As the Blanket Project approached its first anniversary, the numbers were impressive. 12 warmth stations were now operating throughout the city, serving over 2,000 individuals. More than 300 volunteers were involved in various capacities, and partnerships with schools and businesses continued to grow. But the statistics that mattered most to Jamie weren't about numbers served or blankets distributed. They were about transformation, both in the people who received help and in the people who gave it. The project had created a community of caring that extended far beyond its original scope, touching lives in ways that couldn't be measured or quantified. The anniversary celebration was held at the original warmth station, with speeches from city officials, foundation board members, and most importantly, people whose lives had been changed by the program. Rosa, the elderly woman who had been living in her car, spoke about how the kindness she'd received had given her the strength to rebuild her life. Miguel shared his journey from homelessness to becoming a peer counselor. Anna talked about how a childhood story had inspired her career choice. But it was Lily who brought everyone to tears with her simple, powerful testimony about the night a stranger had sat with her under a highway overpass and convinced her that her life had value. "A year ago, I thought I was going to die in the streets," she said, her voice steady and clear. "I felt like garbage that someone had thrown away. But Jamie and the people at this warmth station didn't just give me a blanket and walk away. They saw me as a human being worth saving." She paused, looking around the room at all the faces watching her with rapt attention. "Now I'm 6 months away from getting my GED. I have a job I love, and I'm planning to go to college next year. But most importantly, I've learned that my worst experiences can become my greatest strengths when I use them to help other people." As the celebration continued around him, Jamie stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The street where the warmth station was located had transformed over the past year, becoming a hub of community activity rather than a place people hurried past without looking. Marcus joined him on the sidewalk, moving more slowly than he used to, but still possessing the sharp intelligence and warm heart that had made all of this possible. "You know what strikes me most about tonight?" Marcus said, looking back through the window at the crowd of people celebrating inside. "What's that?" 12 years ago, David's lesson was something I carried alone. Tonight, it's something that hundreds of people are carrying forward together." Jamie nodded, understanding the profound truth in those words. The ripple effects of kindness had grown from one small act into a movement that was changing how an entire community thought about caring for its most vulnerable members. "I've been thinking about expanding the program to other cities," Jamie said. "Sarah thinks we could have warmth stations in 10 cities within 2 years. Marcus smiled at his godson's ambition. "And what do you think?" "I think David would say we're just getting started." As they stood together on the sidewalk, watching through the window as people from all walks of life shared food and stories and hope, both men felt the presence of that 7-year-old boy who had shared his blanket so many decades ago. His spirit lived on not just in the specific work they were doing, but in the understanding that every person deserved dignity, compassion, and the chance for a better tomorrow.